I don't understand. Why are you laughing at her? The voice cut through the Blue Orchid Hotel's private dining room like a knife through silk, small, clear, and carrying an authority that made every suited executive freeze mid-bite. Wine glasses paused halfway to lips. Whispered insults died on tongues. The kind of silence that only comes when power speaks unexpectedly. Every head at the mahogany table turned toward the center, where a 9-year-old boy stood beside his untouched plate. His dark eyes fixed on the adults around him with an intensity that didn't belong in a child. Kang Soo-min's hand tightened on his wine glass. His wife's mouth fell open. The executives who'd been mocking Nadia Cole just seconds ago shifted uncomfortably in their seats, because the boy standing before them wasn't just any child. He was Kang Ji-ho, youngest son of Kang Dae-shik, head of Korea's most powerful shipping empire, and something much darker underneath. The heir everyone watched but no one understood, because he rarely spoke in these gatherings. But when he did, the room didn't just listen. It held its breath. She was invited, Ji-ho continued, his voice calm but cutting through every attempt at dismissive laughter. Which means she's a guest. My grandmother taught me that guests are protected in our home. Someone tried to laugh it off. Ji-ho, this is adult conversation. Sit down. No. The single word landed like a judge's gavel. At the head of the table, Kang Dae-shik set down his glass with deliberate precision, his eyes fixed on his son with an expression that mixed warning, curiosity, and something that might have been pride. The entire room felt it, that shift in atmosphere when a king recognizes a future king. Ji-ho turned fully toward Nadia then, this black woman at the end of the table who'd sat through 20 minutes of calculated cruelty with her head up and her hands steady. The divorced ex-wife of their African operations manager, the woman they'd invited only to humiliate. They're laughing because you're divorced, Ji-ho said, not cruelly, just stating fact, like he was solving an equation. But my tutor says divorce means you survived a bad situation. That takes more strength than staying. The room could have been carved from ice. Nadia's throat tightened, her fingers pressed into her lap. Because no one in this room full of sharks had defended her. Not once. Not until this child stood up. My mother was divorced too, Ji-ho went on, his voice steady. Before she married my father. People mocked her at dinners like this. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She built something better than what they said she deserved. Ji-ho. Dae-shik's voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of mountains. Enough. The boy turned to face his father. Every person at the table stopped breathing. Father? Ji-ho asked, his head tilted with genuine curiosity. Is strength loud? Or is it quiet? A dangerous question, the kind that couldn't be ignored or deflected. The executives shifted nervously. They knew this wasn't just a child asking. This was a test, a challenge, a future leader measuring the room and finding it wanting. Dae-shik studied his son for a long, calculating moment. Then, slowly, he leaned back in his chair, a gesture everyone recognized as permission. Finish, he said. Ji-ho nodded once, then turned back to the table of adults who'd been laughing just minutes ago. You called her useless, he said simply. You said she was nothing without her husband, that she came here desperate for scraps. Faces paled, postures stiffened. But I read the files, Ji-ho continued. She rebuilt the Lagos route after it collapsed, the one that was losing us $3 million a month. She negotiated with people you were too afraid to meet. You profited? Then you discarded her when her husband left. The color drained from Kang Soo-min's face. How would you? Where did you? I asked why you hated her so much, Jiho said, his eyes never leaving Nadia's face. And no one had a good answer. So, I looked myself. He pulled a folded document from his jacket pocket, the way he'd seen his father do in 100 business meetings, and placed it on the table. My father keeps copies of everything, he said softly. Even the things he pretends to forget. Daeshik's gaze sharpened, but he didn't stop his son. She was paid 40% of what she earned, Jiho read from the document, and blamed when profits dropped after she left. But the profits dropped because the people she negotiated with wouldn't work with her replacement. The room was no longer mocking. It was recalculating, repositioning, recognizing power where they'd seen weakness. Nadia felt something unfamiliar rising in her chest. Not anger, not even vindication. Something bigger. Truth. Spoken by someone who owed her nothing. She's not weak, Jiho said, looking around the table at each face. You are, because you need someone smaller to feel tall. A woman gasped. Someone's chair scraped back. Kang Daeshik stood. The entire room followed like puppets on strings. Instinct, hierarchy, survival. He walked to his son, placed a hand on his shoulder. Then he did something no one at that table expected. He turned to Nadia and bowed his head. My son is correct, he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. And you were wronged under my roof, by people who represent my business. The words landed heavier than any apology Nadia had imagined in her darkest, angriest moments. You are no longer a guest at this table, Daeshik continued. You are under my protection. Anyone who speaks against you speaks against me. The table erupted into murmurs, shocked whispers. The sound of alliances crumbling and reforming in real time. Nadia rose slowly, her legs steadier than she expected. She picked up her clutch, her coat. I don't need protection, she said gently, meeting Daeshik's eyes. I needed truth, and your son gave me that. She looked at Jiho then, really looked at this 9-year-old boy who'd stood up when no one else would. Not a weapon, not a political move, a conscience. Thank you, she said simply. Jiho smiled, small, proud, satisfied. You already won, he whispered. They just didn't know it yet. Nadia walked toward the door, her heels clicking on marble, her head high. Behind her, she heard chairs scraping, voices rising, the sound of powerful people scrambling to realign themselves with new information. Wait, Ms. Cole, perhaps we should discuss. She didn't turn around. At the doorway, she paused just once, glancing back at the table. At Jiho, who was sitting down now, watching her with those 2 old eyes. At Daeshik, who nodded once in acknowledgement. Your son will be a better leader than all of you, she said, because he already understands what you don't. What's that? Someone asked. That real power doesn't come from making people smaller. It comes from standing up when it costs you something. She walked out of the Blue Orchid Hotel alone, into the Seoul night. Behind her, deals were reconsidered. Phone calls were made, and Kang Soo-min quietly excused himself from the table, knowing his position had just become very precarious. But before we see what happens next, I need you to do something. Drop a comment right now. What would you have done if you were Nadia? Would you have stayed and pressed your advantage, or walked away with your dignity? Hit that like and subscribe, because what happens next is going to show you exactly why Jiho stood up that night and what it cost him. Trust me, you don't want to miss how a 9-year-old boy became Nadia's most unexpected ally. Now, let's rewind and see how Nadia Cole went from a respected operations manager to the most humiliated woman at that table, and why the Kang family's cruelty that night was built on 8 years of lies. 8 years earlier, Nadia Cole had signed her marriage certificate with hands that trembled with joy. Marcus Cole, charming and ambitious, had promised her the world, or at least a corner of it where they could build something meaningful together. He'd been the face of the Kang family's African operations. She'd been the mind behind it. Not that anyone knew that. When the Lagos route collapsed, shipments delayed, bribes mismanaged, local partnerships crumbling, it was Nadia who spent 3 months sleeping in warehouse offices, negotiating with port authorities who didn't want to deal with a foreign company. It was Nadia who learned enough Yoruba to build trust, who understood that business in West Africa wasn't about contracts, it was about relationships. She rebuilt that route from ash, then Accra, then Dakar. Marcus showed up for the champagne toasts and took the credit. The Kang executives never questioned it. Why would they? He was the manager. She was just the wife who tagged along. "You're good at this," Marcus had told her once, watching her finalize a deal that would save them $2 million in quarterly losses. "But let me handle the presentations. They respect men more in these meetings." She'd believed he was protecting her, that he understood the culture better. She'd been so naive. The marriage lasted 4 years. It died quietly, the way trust does, in 1,000 small cuts. The moment she realized Marcus was telling the Kang family that his strategies saved the African roots, that his connections made the deals work, that Nadia was just administrative support. "You're making this difficult," he'd said when she confronted him. "They don't need to know every detail. What matters is the results." "I am the results," she'd whispered. He'd filed for divorce 3 weeks later. The real nightmare began after the papers were signed. Suddenly, every problem in the African operations was Nadia's fault. The route she'd built with her own sweat somehow failed the quarter after she left, because Marcus didn't understand the relationship she'd cultivated, the delicate balance she'd maintained. But the Kang family blamed her anyway. "Sabotage," they whispered. "Revenge," they suggested. A woman scorned. The professional blacklisting was surgical and quiet. Calls unreturned, interviews that went nowhere, her name attached to failure in rooms she'd never entered. Then came the NDA. Marcus's lawyer, smooth and apologetic, explaining that for everyone's protection, Nadia should sign an agreement not to discuss her role in Kang operations. Nothing personal, just business. "If you don't sign," he'd said gently, "Mr. Cole will be forced to pursue legal action for breach of confidential business practices." She'd signed because she was tired. Because she had $847 in her bank account. Because fighting powerful people requires resources she didn't have. That was 3 years ago. The invitation had arrived last week. Embossed cardstock, formal language. "The Kang family requests the honor of your presence to discuss the Lagos partnership and acknowledge past contributions." Nadia had stared at it for 20 minutes. Her best friend, Simone, had been blunt. "It's a trap. They don't acknowledge anything. They destroy and forget." "I know," Nadia had said quietly. "Then why are you even considering it?" Because she'd spent 3 years being erased. 3 years watching Marcus take credit for her work in trade publications. 3 years of silence and invisibility. "I'm not going for reconciliation," Nadia had finally said. "I'm going because I want to look them in the eye, just once. And know I survived what they did to me." Dignity. That's all she wanted. Just to sit at that table with her head up and show them she wasn't broken. So she'd accepted. Bought a dress she couldn't quite afford. Practiced keeping her face neutral in the mirror. What she hadn't expected was this. The mocking started before the appetizers arrived. Subtle at first. Comments about how nice it was that she'd recovered from the divorce. Questions about her current employment situation that everyone knew was precarious. Mentions of Marcus's new wife, who was so much more suited to the lifestyle. Then it escalated. Her accent, her hair, her temporary value now that she was divorced and unemployed. And Marcus, her ex-husband, the man who'd stolen 4 years and her reputation, sat 3 seats down and said nothing. Just looked at his plate and let them tear her apart. Nadia kept her hands folded, her face calm. She'd survived worse than words. But as Kang Soo-min launched into another thinly veiled insult about women who overestimate their importance, something clicked into place. The timing of this dinner. The seating arrangement. Marcus's convenient presence. The unified cruelty. This was never about acknowledging her contributions. This was a performance. A calculated humiliation designed to remind her, and anyone who might ask questions, that Nadia Cole was nothing. That she'd always been nothing. They'd invited her here to break her publicly, to ensure she never spoke up about what really happened in Lagos. Nadia's throat tightened. Not with tears. With rage she'd buried for 3 years. And that's when the chair scraped back. To understand why everyone at that table went silent when Jiho stood up, you need to understand what the Kang family really was. On paper, they were shipping magnates, import-export, logistics, legitimate businesses with offices in 12 countries and enough lawyers to drown any accusation in paperwork. Off paper, they were something else entirely. The kind of family where people who asked too many questions about cargo manifests had a way of accepting early retirement. Where port officials who refused cooperation found their families suddenly needing protection. Where business disputes were settled in private meetings that left no witnesses. Nadia had learned this slowly during her marriage. The hushed phone calls Marcus took at 3 a.m. The executives who visited their home carrying briefcases that were never opened in her presence. The way certain names made everyone in a room suddenly very interested in their drinks. It's just business, Marcus had told her once. Korean business works differently. You wouldn't understand. She'd understood more than he thought. She'd just been smart enough to stay quiet. Kang Dae-shik, the patriarch seated at the head of the table, had built this empire on 3 principles: loyalty, silence, and the strategic use of humiliation. People who betrayed the family disappeared. People who talked found their reputations destroyed before anything worse happened. And people who needed to be controlled were publicly diminished until they understood their place. He never raised his voice. Never needed to. Power, real power, didn't announce itself. It simply was. The executives surrounding him, Kang Soo-min, Park Jin-woo, the others, they'd risen through the ranks by understanding this, by knowing when to speak and when to let silence do the work, by recognizing that in the Kang world, there were people who mattered and people who were disposable. Divorced women fell firmly into the second category, especially foreign divorced women. Especially Black divorced women who'd had access to files they shouldn't have touched, conversations they shouldn't have overheard. She was always too curious, Nadia heard someone whisper behind cupped hands. Too involved in things that weren't her concern. Another voice, barely audible. Does she know about the Mozambique route? If she does, we have bigger problems than Marcus's failed marriage. Nadia kept her expression neutral, but her pulse quickened. The Mozambique route. She'd stumbled across those shipping manifests once, late at night in Marcus's office. cargo weights that didn't match customs declarations, destinations that changed mid-transit. She'd never asked about them directly. She'd been too afraid of the answer. But they didn't know that. To them, she was a liability. Someone who'd been too close to the operations, too competent at her job, too capable of connecting dots they needed to stay separate. This dinner wasn't just humiliation. It was assessment. They were testing whether she'd stayed silent, whether she understood the rules, whether she needed to be reminded or permanently silenced. Nadia's hands felt cold despite the room's warmth. Across the table, she noticed something else. Something that had been nagging at her since she arrived. The boy, Kang Ji-ho, 9 years old, seated between his father and another executive, expected to sit quietly through a business dinner like all the other Kang children were trained to do. But he wasn't looking at his plate. He was watching. Really watching. His eyes moved from person to person as they spoke. When Kang Soo-min made his crack about Nadia overestimating her importance, Ji-ho's gaze sharpened. When the woman beside him whispered that Nadia ate like she was afraid the food would disappear, the boy's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He was cataloging everything, every insult, every laugh, every moment of cruelty, and his father, Dae-shik, was watching him watch. A strange expression on his face that Nadia couldn't quite read. Testing his son, perhaps. Teaching him how power worked in their world. But the lesson didn't seem to be landing the way Dae-shik expected. "Tell me, Miss Cole," Kang Soo-min said, his smile sharp as broken glass. "After everything that happened, what made you think you were welcome back at this table?" The question hung in the air, a trap disguised as curiosity. Nadia opened her mouth to respond, something neutral, something that wouldn't give them ammunition. But before she could speak, Ji-ho's chair scraped against marble. The sound cut through the room like a gunshot, and then the boy was standing, small and furious, reaching into his jacket pocket. His hand emerged holding something that made Kang Soo-min go absolutely pale. A folded document with the Kang Industries seal clearly visible. "I don't understand," Ji-ho said, his voice carrying in the sudden silence. "Why are you laughing at her?" The document in Ji-ho's small hand looked impossibly official. The Kang Industries seal embossed in silver. Confidential markings along the edges. The kind of paperwork that lived in locked filing cabinets in Dae-shik's private office, not in a 9-year-old's jacket pocket. Kang Soo-min's face went from flushed with wine to pale as ash. "Ji-ho, where did you get that?" The boy didn't answer him. His eyes were still locked on Nadia, and in them she saw something that made her chest tighten. Not pity, but recognition. Like he'd seen something in those files that the adults had deliberately chosen not to see. "You called her useless," Ji-ho said, his voice steady. "You said she was nothing without her husband, that she came here desperate for scraps." Someone tried to laugh it off. The sound died quickly. "But I read the files," Ji-ho continued, carefully unfolding the document. "The real ones, from the Lagos route collapse in 2019. Nadia's breath stopped. 2019, the worst year of her marriage, 3 months of hell trying to salvage a route that Marcus had nearly destroyed through neglect and ego. "There are incident reports here," Ji-ho said, his finger tracing lines on the page. "Dated August 15th through November 3rd. 47 separate crisis interventions, all signed by Nadia Cole. All handled between midnight and 6 a.m. because the time zones didn't align with Seoul office hours." The room had gone absolutely silent. The kind of silence that comes before an earthquake. Park Jin-woo leaned forward, his voice careful. "Those are internal documents," How would you? I asked my father's secretary why everyone hated Miss Cole, Jiho said simply. She said it was complicated, so I asked my father. He said she'd made mistakes, so I asked to see the mistake reports. Oh God, Nadia thought. This child had audited the Kang family's lies. There were no mistake reports, Jiho continued. Only success reports, 47 of them, but they all had Mr. Cole's name on the signature line. He looked up, his young face confused in a way that cut deeper than any accusation. Why would someone else's name be on her work? That's not, Kang Soo-min started. I found the originals in the archive room, Jiho interrupted. Before they were corrected, Ms. Cole's signature was whited out. Mr. Cole's was added. I compared the handwriting. Nadia's hands were shaking now, not from fear, from something bigger. All those nights she'd thought her work disappeared into a void, that no one had seen her, that she'd been erased so completely there was no evidence she'd ever mattered. It had been documented, and then deliberately hidden. The compensation records are worse, Jiho said, pulling out another page. His voice carried the kind of matter-of-fact horror that only children can deliver. Ms. Cole was paid $74,000 annually for managing 3 countries. Mr. Cole was paid $340,000 for attending meetings about her work. A woman across the table made a small, strangled sound. That's not. Those numbers are confidential, someone protested. My father says transparency builds trust, Jiho said, looking toward Daeshik with genuine confusion. But these files weren't transparent. They were hidden. Why hide something unless it's wrong? Kang Soo-min's face had gone from pale to red. This is inappropriate. These are complex business arrangements that a child cannot possibly. After Ms. Cole left, Jiho continued, ignoring him entirely. The Lagos route lost $2.3 million in the first quarter. The Accra route lost partnership contracts with 4 major suppliers. Dakar route completely collapsed within 6 months. He looked around the table, his young face creased with genuine puzzlement. The reports say it was because Ms. Cole sabotaged operations before leaving, but she signed a legal agreement not to contact any Kang business partners. I found that document too. She couldn't have sabotaged anything. She wasn't allowed to. The silence was deafening now. So I asked Mr. Park why the routes really failed, Jiho said, gesturing to the executive who'd been particularly vicious in his mockery earlier. He said Mr. Cole had everything under control, but the quarterly reports show Mr. Cole didn't speak to a single African partner for 7 months after the divorce. He didn't even know their names. Park Jin-woo looked like he wanted to sink through the floor. The routes failed because you got rid of the person who built them, Jiho said, his voice still calm, still factual. And then you blamed her for your failure, and you paid someone else for her work, and tonight you invited her here to humiliate her. He carefully refolded the documents and looked around the table. I don't understand why adults lie so much, he said quietly. My grandmother says lying is what weak people do when they're afraid of the truth. Nadia felt tears burning behind her eyes. Not from sadness, from vindication so sudden and complete, it felt like drowning in air. Every executive at the table was recalculating. Some were looking at Daeshik, trying to read whether this was a test they'd failed. Others were looking at each other, wondering who would be blamed. Then, slowly, deliberately, Kang Daeshik stood. The sound of his chair scraping back made everyone else rise instinctively, like puppets pulled by invisible strings. Daeshik didn't speak. He simply extended his hand toward his son. Jiho placed the documents in his father's palm without hesitation. The room held its breath as Daeshik unfolded the pages. His eyes moved across the text, with the methodical precision of a man who'd built an empire by seeing what others tried to hide. Every person at that table knew this silence, had feared it in boardrooms and negotiation halls. Silence from Kang Dae-shik meant calculation. It meant someone was about to lose something they couldn't afford to lose. One page, then another. His expression revealed nothing. 30 seconds became a minute. The minute stretched into something unbearable. Nadia watched him. This man who'd built a dynasty on loyalty and ruthlessness, whose reputation made grown men nervous. She'd met him only twice during her marriage. Brief, formal encounters where he'd looked through her rather than at her. He was looking now. What Nadia didn't know, what no one at that table knew, was that Dae-shik had been watching Ji-ho differently for the past year. It had started small. The boy asking why a business partner was punished for honesty, while a liar was promoted. Why strength meant never admitting mistakes. Why power required making people afraid. Because that's how the world works, Dae-shik had told him. But is that how it should work? Ji-ho had asked. The question had haunted Dae-shik for months, because he'd built his world on fear and control, on strategic cruelty and calculated humiliation. It had made him powerful. It had made him rich. It had made him, he was beginning to realize, exactly like his own father. A man Dae-shik had spent his entire life both emulating and despising. His son was supposed to inherit this empire. But what empire was he inheriting, and what kind of king would rule it? Dae-shik looked up from the documents. His gaze swept across the table. These executives who'd laughed at a woman they'd exploited, who'd rewritten history to cover their incompetence, who'd built their positions on lies he'd been too busy to notice, or too willing to ignore. "Miss Cole," Kang Soo-min started, his voice regaining some confidence. "Clearly kept copies of confidential materials in violation of her NDA. This is corporate espionage." "She didn't keep copies," Ji-ho said flatly. "I found them in our archives, in filing cabinets she's never accessed. These are our lies, not her theft." "You don't understand business, child," Park Jin-woo said, desperation creeping into his voice. "Sometimes compensation structures are complicated." 40% of earned value isn't complicated, Ji-ho interrupted. "It's theft. The Roots failed because she poisoned relationships. She was legally barred from contact. You failed because you were incompetent." The executives looked to Dae-shik for intervention, for protection from this child who was dismantling their carefully constructed narrative. Dae-shik said nothing. "Mr. Kang," someone pleaded, "surely you can see this is inappropriate." "My son asked a simple question," Dae-shik said finally, his voice quiet. "Why were you laughing at our guest?" The table went silent. "I would like an answer," Dae-shik continued. "One that doesn't involve lies I can now prove you told." No one spoke. Dae-shik turned to Nadia then, really looked at her for the first time. This woman who'd rebuilt his African operations while being paid less than his secretary. Who'd been systematically erased and then blamed for the erasure. "Ms. Cole," he said. "Would you like to respond?" Nadia stood slowly. Her hands were steady now. Her voice, when it came, was calm. The kind of calm that comes after surviving something meant to break you. "I came here tonight thinking I needed closure," she said. "I thought if I could sit at this table with my dignity intact, that would be enough." She looked at each face. At Soo-min, who'd called her desperate. At Park, who'd mocked her accent. At Marcus, her ex-husband, who'd stolen her work and said nothing while they tore her apart. But I don't need closure from people who were never honest enough to give me a real ending, she continued. I needed truth. Your son gave me that. The rest of you can keep your apologies. The words landed like stones in still water. Daeshik studied her for a long moment. Then he did something that made every person at that table understand the world had fundamentally shifted. He bowed his head to her. Not a casual nod, a full, deliberate bow of respect. My son is correct, he said when he straightened. You were wronged. Under my roof, by people who represent my business and my family name. The room erupted in whispers, shock, calculation, the sound of power realigning in real time. You are no longer a guest at this table, Daeshik continued, his voice carrying absolute authority. You are under my protection. Anyone who speaks against you speaks against the Kang family. Anyone who acts against you acts against me. Nadia's breath caught. Protection from Kang Daeshik wasn't just words. It was armor. It was a shield that could destroy careers, end reputations, make enemies disappear. It was the most dangerous gift anyone could receive. The room waited for Nadia to accept, to show gratitude, to understand the magnitude of what Kang Daeshik had just offered. Protection from one of the most powerful families in Korea. Safety that came with resources, connections, the weight of a name that made governments pause. It was what anyone in her position should want, should need. Nadia took a breath. When she spoke, her voice was gentle but unmovable. I don't need protection. The words landed like a crack in glass, quiet but devastating. Daeshik's eyes narrowed slightly, not with anger, with curiosity. People didn't refuse his protection. They begged for it. Ms. Cole, he said carefully, you may not fully understand the weight of what's happened here tonight. These people have already taken years from me, Nadia interrupted softly. And I survived. I rebuilt. I kept going without anyone's permission or protection. She looked at Marcus then, her ex-husband who'd shrunk into his chair. Who'd promised her protection once. Who'd used that promise to control her, to keep her quiet, to make her believe she was nothing without him. Protection was what my husband offered when he told me not to correct people about whose work saved Lagos, she said. Protection was what your lawyers offered when they made me sign away my voice. Protection was the excuse used every time someone powerful decided I should be smaller. Her hands were steady. Her voice never wavered. Protection isn't safety, she continued. It's just another word for control. And I didn't survive the last 3 years by being controlled. I survived by remembering who I am. Jiho was watching her with those two old eyes, and something in his expression shifted. Understanding, maybe. Or recognition. What did you want then? Daeshik asked, not dismissively, genuinely curious. If not protection, what did you come here for? Nadia turned to face him fully. Truth, she said simply. I wanted someone to acknowledge that what happened to me was wrong, that I wasn't crazy or bitter or incompetent, that the work I did mattered and the lies told about me were just that. Lies. She gestured to the document still in Daeshik's hand. Your son gave me that. He saw what grown men and women chose to ignore. He asked questions when everyone else accepted convenient stories. He stood up when people who knew better stayed silent. Her voice caught slightly. Not from weakness. From the weight of vindication she'd stopped believing would ever come. I wanted my name back, she said. Not protection, not revenge, just acknowledgement that Nadia Cole built something real and people benefited from destroying her for it. The silence that followed was different from before. Not calculating, not tense, humbled. You already won, Jiho whispered, just loud enough for the table to hear. Nadia looked at him, this 9-year-old boy who'd understood something fundamental that the adults around him had forgotten. That real power wasn't protecting people. It was telling the truth when it cost you something. Thank you, she said to him, for being braver than anyone else here. Around the table, executives were exchanging glances, not mocking ones, calculating ones. If Dae-shik respected this woman enough to bow, and she refused his protection with dignity instead of fear, then she wasn't powerless. She was something more dangerous, someone who couldn't be bought or controlled, and the people who'd lied about her were suddenly very exposed. Park Jin-woo was already mentally drafting his resignation. Kang Soo-min was wondering if he could salvage his position by claiming ignorance. Marcus was staring at his plate, realizing that his ex-wife had just demonstrated more strength in 5 minutes than he'd shown in 5 years. The business deals that had brought them all to this table, partnerships, contracts, alliances built on the assumption that certain people mattered and others didn't, those were quietly beginning to collapse. Because Dae-shik was watching, really watching, seeing his executives not as loyal soldiers, but as the architects of institutional rot his son had just exposed. Ms. Cole, Dae-shik said finally. His voice had changed. Less patriarch, more something else. Someone reassessing everything he thought he understood about power. You honor my son by refusing me. That's rare. Your son honored me first, Nadia replied. I'm just returning what he gave. She picked up her clutch from beside her plate, the small, deliberate gesture of someone preparing to leave. You're welcome to stay, Dae-shik said. The dinner is over, Nadia finished gently. For me, at least. She looked around the table one final time, at the executives who'd humiliated her, at Marcus, who'd stolen her work, at the empty wine glasses and half-eaten meals and the expensive silence that had been designed to crush her. I came here expecting to be broken, she said. Instead, I was reminded of who I've always been. Someone who builds things, someone who survives, someone who doesn't need permission to exist. She stood. The scrape of her chair against marble was the only sound in the room. Nadia reached for her coat where it hung on the back of her chair. The simple black wool felt heavier than it had when she arrived, weighted with everything this evening had become. No one moved to help her. They just watched. She slipped it on with practiced grace, the kind that came from years of maintaining composure when everything inside was screaming. But tonight, the screaming had quieted. Something else had taken its place. Peace. Before turning to leave, Nadia looked back at the table one final time. All these powerful people frozen in their expensive clothes and their expensive silence, waiting to see what she would do next, how she would use this moment. I came here tonight expecting to be humiliated, she said quietly, her voice carrying through the crystal and mahogany. I thought this dinner was about closure, about finally putting the past behind me and moving forward. She paused, letting the words settle. I was wrong. This was never about closure. It was about reminding me that I was supposed to stay broken, stay silent, stay small enough to fit inside the story you told about me. Marcus flinched. Kang Soo-min stared at his wineglass like it held answers. But instead of humiliation, I found something I'd stopped looking for, Nadia continued. Clarity, the truth I already knew but couldn't prove, that I wasn't crazy, I wasn't bitter, I wasn't incompetent. She looked at Jiho, who was watching her with those dark, serious eyes. I was just inconvenient, and inconvenient people get erased in rooms like this, by people who've learned that power means never having to admit you were wrong. She smiled then, small, genuine, directed at the boy. Your son didn't give me protection or power or anything I could spend, she said to Daeshik. He gave me something more valuable. He gave me proof that my truth mattered, that it existed outside of my memory, that I wasn't fighting shadows. Jiho's expression shifted, pride mixed with something deeper. Understanding, maybe, of what he'd really done. Thank you, Nadia said to him. For being brave when being quiet would have been easier. For asking questions when accepting lies would have been simpler. For standing up when everyone else stayed seated. She turned toward the door, then paused. And to everyone else, she said, her voice still gentle but carrying an edge sharp enough to cut. I hope you remember this. Remember that the person you tried to erase tonight walked out of here with her head up. That the weakness you mocked was actually strength you didn't recognize. That dignity doesn't require anyone's permission. The silence was absolute. Nadia walked toward the exit. Her heels clicked against marble. Each step measured, unhurried, the sound of someone who had nothing left to prove. She passed Daeshik's chair. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not anger, not regret. Something closer to reassessment. Like he was seeing not just her, but his entire world differently. She passed the executives who'd laughed at her. Not one met her eyes. She passed Marcus, who looked like he wanted to say something. His mouth opened. She kept walking. The doors to the private dining room were heavy, ornate things that required both hands to open. Nadia pushed through them alone, and they swung shut behind her with a soft, final sound. The hotel corridor was empty. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over plush carpet and gilt-framed mirrors. She could hear the muffled sound of other dinners, other conversations, other lives happening behind closed doors. She walked toward the exit, past the concierge desk, past the lounge where hotel guests sipped cocktails and laughed at things that would be forgotten by morning. The doorman opened the heavy glass doors. Taxi, ma'am. No, thank you, Nadia said. I think I'll walk. Outside, the Seoul night was cool and clear. The city lights reflected off glass towers, painting the sky in shades of gold and blue. Traffic hummed in the distance. Life continued, indifferent and constant. Nadia stood on the sidewalk for a moment, just breathing. The air tasted different, cleaner. Like something heavy had been lifted from her lungs. She wasn't vindicated because powerful people acknowledged her. She was vindicated because she'd finally stopped waiting for their permission to know her own worth. For the first time in 3 years, Nadia felt light. She started walking, her heels clicking against pavement, her coat wrapped against the November chill. She didn't know where she was going, didn't care. She was free. Inside the Blue Orchid Hotel's private dining room, the silence stretched into something unbearable. Then Kang Dae-shik spoke. Everyone except my son, he said quietly. Leave. Park Jin-woo stood so quickly his chair nearly tipped. Others followed, scrambling toward the exit with the desperate efficiency of people who knew consequences were coming. Marcus hesitated at the door. Not you, Dae-shik said without looking at him. You stay. The remaining executives filed out. The doors closed. Only 4 people remained. Dae-shik, Jiho, Marcus, and Kang Soo-min, who looked like he might be sick. Dae-shik picked up the documents his son had brought, read them again in the new silence. When he finally looked up, his expression was the one that had built an empire. Now, he said softly, we discuss what happens to people who lie to me. The first crack appeared 3 days after the dinner. Park Jin-woo submitted his resignation via email at 2:47 a.m. No explanation, no attempt to salvage his position. Just a terse paragraph thanking the Kang family for the opportunity and a request that his severance package be processed quickly. Dae-shik approved it without comment. The second crack came during the quarterly review meeting. Kang Soo-min presented his division's numbers with the confidence of someone who'd survived worse scrutiny. But when he clicked to the slide showing African operations performance, Dae-shik's hand raised. Stop. The room went silent. Explain the Accra route losses, Dae-shik said quietly. Soo-min's prepared answer died on his tongue, because the question wasn't about the numbers. It was about the lies that had protected those numbers for 3 years. Market volatility. Try again. Soo-min's face paled. Around the table, other executives studied their laptops with sudden intensity. We lost key partnerships after Ms. Cole's departure, Soo-min finally admitted. Because? The silence stretched. Dae-shik let it. Because we couldn't maintain the relationship she'd built, Soo-min whispered. And you blamed her for sabotage. Yes, knowing it was a lie. Soo-min said nothing. There was nothing to say. You're reassigned, Dae-shik said. Effective immediately. Compliance review. You'll assist the external auditors with the full investigation into compensation discrepancies and signature falsifications. It wasn't termination. It was something worse. Public demotion, stripped of authority. Forced to participate in the exposure of his own corruption. A message to everyone else in the room. Lies cost more than jobs. The investigation spread quietly through Kang Industries, like frost across glass. External auditors requested files. HR conducted confidential interviews. People who'd laughed at Nadia 3 nights ago suddenly couldn't remember making any comments. Marcus received a different kind of consequence. Not termination. Not demotion. Something more surgical. Every project he'd claimed credit for was re-examined. Every report he'd signed was compared against archived originals. His compensation history was audited line by line. And when the discrepancies became undeniable, Dae-shik called him into his office alone. What was said in that meeting, no one knew. Marcus emerged 20 minutes later, gray-faced and trembling. He resigned the following morning. But the real shift wasn't in firings or resignations. It was in how people looked at Ji-ho now. The 9-year-old who'd been tolerated, sometimes ignored, occasionally humored in business meetings. Suddenly, his questions carried weight. When he asked why certain decisions were made, executives answered carefully. Honestly, because they'd seen what happened when adults lied to him. Dae-shik watched this transformation with something between pride and unease. His son was learning power, yes, but not the power Dae-shik had taught. Something different, something cleaner. Father, Ji-ho asked one evening, did you know about the files before I showed you? Dae-shik set down his tea, considered the question and the weight it carried. I knew there were problems, he said finally. I chose not to look closely. Why? Because looking meant admitting his executives were corrupt, that his empire was built on convenient lies, that loyalty had become complicity. Because it was easier, Dae-shik admitted, and easier is often wrong. Ji-ho nodded, processing this with that too-old wisdom. What would grandmother say? The boy asked. Dae-shik smiled despite himself. His mother, who'd died 2 years ago, who'd taught Ji-ho about protecting guests and speaking truth. She'd say I was becoming my father, and not in a good way. Are you going to change? The question hung between them, not accusatory, just curious, genuine. I'm trying, Daeshik said. You're teaching me how. Across the city, in a small apartment she could barely afford, Nadia's phone buzzed. Another job offer. The third this week. The first had come from a shipping company in Singapore. VP of African Operations, 6-figure salary, full relocation package. The second from a European logistics firm that had somehow learned she was available. The third, just now, from a startup backed by investors who'd heard interesting things about her strategic capabilities. She declined them all. Not from pride, not from fear, from clarity. She was done building other people's empires while they took credit. Instead, she spent her days at a coffee shop near Hongdae, laptop open, building something new. Consulting contracts with small companies who needed African market expertise, direct partnerships, her name on her work. It was smaller than what she'd had, more precarious. It was hers. Her phone buzzed again. Not another job offer. A message from an unknown number. My father says you were right to refuse his protection. He also says he's learning what real strength looks like. Thank you for teaching me too. Ji-ho. Nadia stared at the message for a long time. Then she smiled and typed back. Thank you for being brave. Keep asking the hard questions. The world needs people who do. She pressed send and returned to her laptop, to the proposal she was drafting, to the future she was building one honest contract at a time. Outside, Seoul hummed with its endless, indifferent energy. But inside that coffee shop, something fundamental had shifted. Nadia Cole was no longer erased. She was just beginning. 3 months later, Nadia stood in front of a classroom of 20 young women, most of them in their early 20s. All of them hungry for something the world kept telling them they couldn't have. Careers in international logistics, leadership positions in male-dominated industries, the audacity to believe their work mattered as much as anyone else's. The Lagos route collapsed because the people running it didn't understand that business in West Africa isn't about contracts, Nadia explained, pulling up a presentation slide. It's about relationships, about showing up, about remembering that the person across the table has a name, a family, a reason for being cautious with foreigners who make promises. A hand went up. A young black woman with natural hair and nervous energy. How do you make them trust you? She asked. When they've been burned before? Nadia smiled, not the careful, controlled smile she'd worn at that dinner table. A real one. You show up consistently, she said. You learn their language, not perfectly, but enough to show respect. You remember their children's names. You don't make promises you can't keep, and when something goes wrong, you fix it yourself instead of sending someone else to clean up your mess. The young woman nodded, writing furiously. This was Nadia's life now. Teaching at a women's business institute in Chicago, consulting for companies that actually valued expertise over optics, building something that couldn't be erased because it lived in the knowledge she passed forward. The university had found her through a strange chain of events. A reference from a Korean shipping executive who'd suddenly become very interested in correcting historical records, a generous endowment that appeared with no name attached. A position created specifically for someone with her experience. Nadia suspected Daeshik's hand in it. Not protection. He'd learned she didn't want that. Just correction. Setting things right in the only way he knew how. She'd accept it. Not because she needed his help, but because the work itself mattered. After class, Nadia checked her email. Between messages from students and meeting requests, there was one that made her pause. The sender. J.H. Kanga Kangind Kr. The subject line. Thank you. She opened it. Ms. Cole, my father says I'm not supposed to contact people from business dinners without permission. But my tutor says thank you notes are never inappropriate, so I'm hoping both things can be true. I wanted to tell you that I've been thinking about what you said, about dignity not requiring permission. My father has been different since that night. He asks more questions now. He listens differently. He fired 3 executives. He promoted 2 people who were afraid to speak up before. He says I taught him something, but I think you taught both of us. I'm learning that strength isn't about being the loudest or the scariest. It's about being brave enough to tell the truth when everyone else wants to pretend. I hope I grow up strong like you. Respectfully, Kang Ji-ho. Nadia read it twice. Then a third time, her vision blurring slightly. She'd spent 3 years believing she'd lost everything. Her marriage, her career, her reputation, her sense of self. But she hadn't lost anything real. She'd shed things that were never hers to begin with. Marcus's borrowed credibility, the Kang family's conditional approval, the lie that she needed anyone's permission to matter. What remained was the truth, and the truth, it turned out, was weightless. It made you lighter, not heavier. She typed a reply. Ji-ho, thank you for your message. Your father is lucky to have a son who asks the right questions. You're already strong. You were strong at 9 years old when you stood up in that room. Strength isn't something you grow into. It's something you choose, over and over again. Keep asking questions. Keep telling the truth. Keep being brave. The world needs more people like you. Nadia. She hit send, then closed her laptop. Outside her office window, Chicago stretched toward Lake Michigan, gray sky meeting gray water. Students crossed the quad below, bundled against November wind, laughing and arguing and becoming whoever they were meant to be. Nadia wasn't the same woman who'd sat at that dinner table. She was someone who'd survived the erasure and come out knowing exactly who she'd always been. Someone who built things. Someone who told the truth. Someone who didn't need to roar to be heard. She picked up her coat, the same black wool she'd worn that night, and headed out to meet Simone for coffee. Her best friend had been asking about the Seoul trip for months, and Nadia had finally found the words to explain what happened. Not a victory, not revenge. Something better. Healing. Halfway across the world, in a corporate tower in Seoul, Kang Ji-ho sat beside his father in yet another business meeting. Executives presented quarterly projections. Charts appeared on screens. Voices rose and fell with the rhythm of negotiation. Ji-ho listened quietly, the way he always did. Watching. Learning. Seeing the spaces between what people said and what they meant. His father glanced at him once, a brief look that held something new. Not expectation. Not pressure. Pride. The meeting continued. Numbers were debated. Decisions were made. The kind of power plays that had built empires and destroyed lives. And in the middle of it all, a 9-year-old boy sat unchanged, observant, already understanding what many adults never learned. That real strength doesn't announce itself with threats or displays. It doesn't require witnesses or applause. Real strength stands up quietly when staying seated would be easier. Real strength asks uncomfortable questions when comfortable lies would be simpler. Real strength tells the truth, even when the truth costs something, especially then. The end. Real strength doesn't roar. It stands up quietly and tells the truth. Thanks so much, my dear friends, for enjoying this beautiful story till this end. If you've not subscribed, kindly subscribe now to be notified when we drop our next story. Also, like the video and comment where you are watching from and what time it's at your end. Thank you.